The city was a beast of glass and steel, and its breath was a winter wind that bit through Eleanor's thin coat. She was 23, but the hunger had carved decades into her face. Her hands, raw and red, cradled the curve of her belly, a fragile shield against the world's indifference. 8 months. 8 months she had carried this secret life, this tiny, insistent flutter that was both her only reason to live and the very cause of her ruin. She whispered to the bump beneath the frayed fabric, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'm here, little one. I'm still here." But her voice was swallowed by the roar of traffic, another forgotten sound in a metropolis that had no memory for the lost. She wasn't just cold, she was being erased by it. Passers-by saw only what they wanted to see, a problem, a nuisance, a stain on the pristine evening. Their eyes, hard as polished stones, slid past her, their judgment a silent crushing weight. They saw dirty clothes, not the story of a woman who washed them in a public restroom sink until her fingers went numb. They saw tangled hair, not the nights spent sleeping in a bus station, one hand on her belly, the other clutching a worn-out bag. Elena met their gazes for a moment, a spark of defiance in her exhausted eyes before she looked away. Dignity was a luxury she fought for every second, a silent war waged against the shame that threatened to drown her. They didn't see a mother, they saw a mistake. The city lights, once a beacon of her dreams, now mocked her with their careless warmth. Every lit window was a portrait of a life she no longer had access to, a life with a roof, a meal, a door that locked against the dark. The memory of her family's home was a ghost that haunted her, the scent of her mother's cooking a phantom pain sharper than the gnawing in her stomach. The door her father had slammed in her face had echoed in her soul for months, a final, brutal sound that had severed her from everything she had ever known. Abandonment was a cold that seeped deeper than the wind. It was a silence where love used to be, an emptiness that her unborn child's kicks could not fill. Her body was a battlefield of needs. The hunger was a constant, dull ache, a thief that stole her strength and clouded her thoughts. She would stand outside bakeries, inhaling the scent of fresh bread as if air alone could nourish her and the life inside. It was a sweet, unbearable torture. The baby would kick, a small, powerful reminder of the life depending on her, and the desperation would sharpen into a blade. It was for him. Every painful step on the frozen pavement, every humiliating glance she endured, every night she shivered in a hidden doorway, it was all for him. He was a promise of a future, but a future she had no idea how to reach. She was failing him before he was even born. She found a moment of stillness on a park bench, the iron so cold it felt like it was leaching the last of her warmth. The world moved around her in a blur of colored lights and hurried footsteps. In a city of millions, the loneliness was absolute. She felt herself fading, becoming part of the shadows, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's happiness. She closed her eyes, and for a second, she allowed the despair to wash over her. It would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting. But then, a gentle flutter from within, a tiny hiccup, a life that refused to give up. She trembled, but it was not from the cold. It was the terror of a mother who had nothing left to offer but a heart that refused to stop beating. The scent of roasting meat and warm bread wafted from the imposing mansion, a cruel and beautiful torture. It wasn't just food, it was the smell of safety, of a life she was no longer a part of. The hunger inside her had become a living thing, a predator gnawing at her insides, and the baby kicked as if in agreement. A decision, born not of thought but of pure, animal instinct, took root in her exhausted mind. The gates were open for the arriving luxury cars, and a river of elegantly dressed guests flowed toward the light. She would become a shadow, a whisper of movement in the darkness, and slip inside. It was a terrifying risk, a violation of a world that had already cast her out, but the alternative was another night of gnawing emptiness, a cold that promised only to deepen. She moved with the practiced invisibility of the ignored, her thin frame melting into the spaces between manicured hedges and gleaming limousines. No one looked at her. To them she was less than air. The heavy oak door was a portal to another universe, and for a heart-stopping moment she hesitated on its threshold. Inside, a symphony of laughter, music, and clinking crystal glasses pulsed with a life she could only dream of, Taking a ragged breath that felt like swallowing glass, she slipped through the entrance behind a cluster of loud, perfumed guests. The warmth hit her first, a dizzying, suffocating blanket that made her shiver violently. She was a ghost in a palace, her only goal the promise of discarded scraps from a feast meant for kings. Finding a dark alcove behind a towering floral arrangement, Eleanor sank into the shadows, making herself small. The grand ballroom was a kaleidoscope of shimmering gowns and tailored tuxedos, a sea of careless wealth. She watched them, not with envy, but with the detached curiosity of a biologist studying a foreign species. Her eyes, however, weren't on the diamonds or the champagne. They were fixed on the buffet tables, laden with mountains of food that would soon be cleared away. She could almost taste the bread, feel its softness in her mouth. She just had to wait until they were gone, until their laughter faded, and then she could salvage something for herself and the life inside her. Patience was a skill hunger had taught her well, but her body, a vessel worn thin by months of deprivation, had its own agenda. A tickle started in her throat, a dry, persistent irritation that grew into a deep, rattling cough. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to smother the sound, her eyes wide with panic. Every suppressed spasm was an agony, a betrayal that threatened to expose her fragile presence. The warm, recycled air of the ballroom felt thick and heavy in her lungs, each breath a struggle. Her head grew light, the vibrant colors of the room blurring at the edges. She could feel a pressure building in her chest, a painful tightening that promised to erupt. She was losing control, her own body turning into the enemy within the gates. "What do you think you're doing back there?" The voice was like a whip crack, sharp and laced with suspicion. A security guard, his face a mask of stern disapproval, loomed over her. A woman in a silk dress peered around him, her lips curled in disgust. Elena froze, caught in the beam of their judgment. She tried to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. All the shame and fear she had been swallowing for months rose in her throat. Their eyes weren't just looking at her, they were dissecting her, labeling her, vagrant, thief, filth. They saw her swollen belly not as a sign of life, but as further proof of her moral decay. In their world, poverty was the ugliest of sins. The confrontation shattered her last bit of control. The cough exploded from her, a raw, violent eruption she was powerless to stop. It was a sound that didn't belong in this pristine hall, a ragged, desperate noise that tore through the polite chatter and elegant music. The room fell silent. Every head turned. Eleanor doubled over, clutching her belly as her body was racked by convulsions, each one a hammer blow against her ribs. She was no longer a ghost. She was a spectacle, a grotesque interruption in their perfect evening. The guard took a step back, his expression shifting from suspicion to revulsion. He saw her as a contamination, a disease that had breached the sterile walls of their sanctuary. Then came the final, horrifying betrayal. With one last, agonizing heave, she coughed, and a fine spray of crimson misted the air, landing on the immaculate, cream-colored Persian rug at her feet. The blood was a shocking splash of reality against the woven fantasy of wealth. It was a small stain, but it felt as loud as a scream. To the onlookers, it was the ultimate act of defilement, a deliberate gesture of contempt from a creature who had nothing to lose. They didn't see a symptom of sickness. They saw an insult, a stain of poverty and defiance deliberately smeared upon their perfect world. Elena saw it too, and a wave of profound, soul-crushing shame washed over her. The whispers started instantly, a venomous hiss that spread through the crowd. Disgusting. How did she even get in here? Someone call the police. The judgment was swift, unanimous, and brutal. The guard grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin like claws. He was no longer just going to escort her out. He was going to throw her out, to purge this blight from the premises. Elena looked down at the blood on the priceless rug, a stark symbol of her own brokenness. In that moment, she believed them. She had confirmed their worst assumptions. She wasn't a person anymore. She was just a stain to be removed. And the deepest pain was that she felt she deserved it. The whispers died as the crowd parted, not with respect, but with the reflexive deference given to a force of nature. Through the gap strode Adrian Blackwood. He was not just the host. He was the master of this universe, encased in a tailored suit that seemed forged from shadow and steel. His face was a study in cold geometry, his eyes the color of a winter sky, holding no warmth, only clarity. He moved with an unnerving stillness, a man who never wasted a motion or an emotion. He did not look at the chaos, at the frightened woman or the armed guard. His gaze went directly to the floor, to the small dark blemish on the cream-colored expanse of the rug. It was an imperfection, a flaw in his meticulously controlled world, and his expression was one of pure, quiet annoyance. His eyes, having assessed the damage to his property, finally lifted to the cause. They swept over Eleanor, not as a person, but as a variable in an equation he needed to solve. He saw the frayed coat, the tangled hair, the desperate terror in her eyes, and registered them as data points confirming his initial diagnosis. She was chaos, a problem to be erased. The narrator of this silent story could see inside him, past the icy facade to the sterile emptiness he cultivated. Adrian didn't feel pity or anger, only a profound sense of violation. This woman, with her poverty and her sickness, was a contaminant in the sanctuary he had built to keep the messy, unpredictable pain of the world at bay. Her humanity was irrelevant. A woman adorned with diamonds, her face a mask of theatrical disgust, glided to Adrian's side. "Adrian, darling," she breathed, her voice dripping with venomous sympathy. "How utterly ghastly! She's defiled your mother's antique rug. The creature must have done it deliberately." Her words gave voice to the room's collective judgment, turning Elena from a victim into a malevolent intruder. Adrian offered a curt, almost imperceptible nod, his silence a powerful affirmation of the accusation. He did not need to speak. In his world, his stillness was a verdict. Elena flinched under the weight of his silent agreement, feeling herself shrink, her identity dissolving until all that was left was the stain on the floor and the guilt they had assigned her. Finally, Adrian spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Get her out of my house, now." The words were devoid of heat, a simple, clean command delivered with the same emotional detachment he used to liquidate a failing company. There was no room for appeal. It was a final judgment. Having issued the order, he turned his back on the scene, a gesture of absolute dismissal that was more brutal than any blow. For Adrian Blackwood, the matter was concluded. The disruption was being removed and order would be restored. He was already walking away, leaving Elena to be disposed of like any other piece of trash. The guard's grip on her arm tightened, his knuckles white. He began to pull her, and the world tilted violently. The opulent ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers and perfumed air, became a hostile landscape. Every shimmering dress, every polished shoe, every cold, staring eye was part of an impenetrable fortress designed to keep people like her out. She was a ghost who had dared to touch their world, and now they were exorcising her. The narrator saw the chasm between them, a canyon carved by wealth, power, and a willful blindness to suffering. Elena was not just being thrown out of a house, she was being cast out of the human race by those who believed they owned it. As Adrian moved toward the sanctuary of his private study, his path took him past a large and gilt-edged mirror on the wall. For a single jarring second, he saw the scene reflected back at him, the hulking guard, the murmuring crowd, and the frail, crumpled figure of a woman clutching her swollen belly. The image was distorted by the antique glass, but it struck a dissonant chord deep within him, a flicker of something ancient and buried. It was the ghost of a memory he had spent 5 years trying to kill. He immediately broke eye contact with the reflection, his jaw tightening. His control was absolute. He would not allow a random vagrant to disturb the perfect and sterile peace of his grief. The guests, sensing the crisis was averted, began to recalibrate. Their whispers shifted from shock to a chorus of self-righteous justification, their words weaving a narrative that made the cruelty palatable. "She's probably high on something," one guest murmured to another. "These people have no shame," another agreed, sipping champagne. Adrian did the right thing. She was a threat. They needed to believe she was a monster, a deliberate agent of chaos, because if she was just a desperate, sick woman, then their world, with all its comfort and privilege, was built on a foundation of unforgivable indifference. Her condemnation was their absolution. They were good people. She was the problem. Though he had turned his back, Adrian could not entirely escape the sounds. The woman's ragged, shallow breaths, the scuff of her worn shoes as the guard dragged her toward the door, the quiet, final click of the latch as she was expelled into the cold. The sounds were small, yet they echoed in the vast emptiness of his mansion, an unwelcome intrusion into his self-imposed silence. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar irritation, not at her, but at the crack she represented in his armor. He despised this feeling, this unwelcome ripple in the placid surface of his apathy. The encounter was over, the stain was being dealt with, but a seed of disorder had been planted in the one place he thought was safe, his own heart. The guard's grip was a manacle on Elena's thin arm, but she refused to be dragged like an animal. Her resistance wasn't physical, it was in her eyes. She stared at Adrian Blackwood's retreating back, a silent, searing accusation that seemed to burn through the fine wool of his suit. It was not a plea for mercy, but a challenge to his indifference. Her spine, which had been bowed by shame moments before, straightened with a defiant rigidity. She was a mother, not a stain. Adrian felt her gaze like a physical weight, a sudden friction in the smooth mechanics of his evening. He had given an order. The problem should have vanished, yet he found himself stopping, his hand hovering over the door to his study, unable to complete the simple act of escape. He turned back slowly, a flicker of raw annoyance crossing his features. This was inefficient. This was messy. Her silent refusal to be dismissed was an act of insubordination against the unwritten laws of his world. He looked at the pronounced curve of her belly, and an image, sharp and unwelcome, pierced his consciousness. His wife, laughing, her hands cradling their future. He recoiled from the memory as if from a hot flame, his mind slamming a door on the past. This woman was a parasite, a symptom of the world's chaos. His hesitation, he rationalized, was a calculated move to avoid a scene. But the narrator knew better. It was the frantic, desperate pounding of a ghost on a locked door inside his soul, a ghost he had sworn to never let out. Mrs. Gable, his head of household and the stern guardian of his sterile peace, glided to his side. "Mr. Blackwood, shall I phone the police?" she asked, her voice as starched and cold as her uniform. "We can have her removed for trespassing and property damage. It will be handled quietly." In her eyes, Eleanor was not a human being in distress. She was a procedural issue, a piece of disorder that required a formal solution. Her words were a life raft of detached logic, offered to a master she knew despised emotional currents. She was reinforcing the fortress walls, reminding him that there were systems in place, official channels designed specifically to purge the inconvenient and the unsightly from worlds like theirs, preserving their pristine and fragile order. Elena's head snapped up at the mention of the police. That word represented a final, uncrossable line, a bureaucratic abyss that would swallow her and her baby, spitting them out into a system with no exits. She found her voice, a dry, hoarse thing that clawed its way out of her throat. "I don't need anything from you," she rasped, her words aimed like arrows directly at Adrian, pointedly ignoring his functionaries. I just needed to be warm for a minute." It wasn't an excuse or an apology. It was a statement of fact, a desperate attempt to frame her reality in terms they could not twist. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't a vandal. She was just cold. But in the opulent heat of the ballroom, her simple truth sounded like the most elaborate and pathetic lie. A humorless smile touched Adrian's lips. "Warm," he repeated, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. It was a line from a bad movie, a textbook manipulation. His entire life was a fortress against such transparent plays for sympathy. He saw her not as desperate, but as calculating, her pregnancy a prop in a well-rehearsed performance for a gullible audience. He closed the distance between them, his shadow falling over her, a physical manifestation of his power. "And the blood?" he asked, his voice a silken threat, spat onto a priceless family heirloom. "Was that part of your plan to get warm too?" The question was designed to shatter her to expose the supposed lie, and restore his own sense of righteous indignation, the emotion that kept his grief safely buried. The calculated cruelty of his words, combined with her body's exhaustion, sent a wave of vertigo through Elena. The glittering chandeliers above began to spin, the faces of the guests morphing into a gallery of grotesque, leering masks. She swayed on her feet, one hand instinctively clutching her belly, the other reaching for a wall that wasn't there. The guard, convinced it was a ploy, yanked her arm harder. "She's putting on a show," he grunted to a nearby guest, who nodded in smug agreement. The injustice was a physical pressure in her chest, suffocating her. They had already written her story, cast her as the villain, and every sign of her genuine suffering was being twisted into further proof of her depravity. As the guard jerked her forward, her frayed tote bag, her last possession, slipped from her grasp. It hit the marble floor with a soft, pathetic thud, spilling its contents: a browning apple core, a small bottle of water, and a thin, worn-out children's book. The book slid across the polished floor and came to rest near the toe of Adrian's immaculate leather shoe. Its cover was faded, the title barely legible, The Velveteen Rabbit. The sight of it stopped Adrian's breath in his chest. It was an impossible coincidence, a cruel taunt from a forgotten corner of his life. It was the book his wife had chosen for their son's nursery, the one she believed taught the true meaning of love. The memory was an ambush, a brutal, unexpected assault on his defenses. He stared at the book, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but inside, a violent storm was raging. He felt a crack, splinter across the frozen surface of his heart, a deep, painful fissure. That book did not belong here in this moment with this woman. It was a sacred relic from a life that was dead, a life he had entombed. Her presence was no longer just an intrusion, it was a desecration. He felt a surge of pure, cold hatred for her, not for what she had done, but for what she had unwittingly unearthed. She had brought the ghost of his wife and son into this room, and for that, he could never, ever forgive her. He looked away, his jaw so tight it ached. Mrs. Gable saw the shift in his demeanor, the dangerous flicker of something other than annoyance in his eyes, and knew she had to intervene. "Sir, the guests," she murmured, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper. "They are recording this. Your reputation." She was right. The sea of onlookers was no longer passive. Their phones were out, small, glowing rectangles, capturing every second of this private drama for public consumption. The pressure was immense. His world, built on control and impenetrable privacy, was being breached. The chaos was spreading. He had to end this. He had to reassert his authority, not just over this woman, but over the narrative itself. The cold, ruthless CEO was clawing his way back to the surface. He looked down at Elena, who was now kneeling, her trembling hands slowly gathering the book and the apple core. She didn't look up at him. She was focused on her small, broken world at his feet. She moved with a slow, deliberate dignity that was both infuriating and heartbreaking. She would not be rushed. She would not be shamed into scurrying away. In her quiet persistence, she was claiming this small patch of marble floor as her own. Adrian Blackwood, the man who could buy and sell cities, stood frozen, locked in a silent war with a homeless, pregnant woman. He could not bring himself to help her, but for the first time in 5 years, he could not bring himself to simply walk away either. The tension was a blade, held between their two shattered worlds. He took a step forward, the final, dismissive words forming on his lips, ready to banish her from his sight and his mind forever. But as Elena knelt to retrieve the book, she looked up, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second. The defiance was gone, replaced by a profound, hollowed-out exhaustion that seemed to swallow the light in the room. It was the look of a soul that had fought for too long and had nothing left. He saw not a manipulator, but a person at the very end of their tether, clinging to the last fragments of her dignity. The sight was a small, sharp stone in the gears of his cold certainty, causing his well-oiled machine of indifference to grind to a halt. The carefully constructed narrative of her villainy began to unravel under the weight of her silent, unbearable pain. The brief surge of adrenaline that had fueled her defiance now abandoned her, leaving a chilling weakness in its wake. A feverish glaze filmed her eyes, and the opulent ballroom began to tilt and swim around her. The glittering chandeliers blurred into pulsating halos of light, and the murmuring of the guests distorted into a meaningless, threatening drone. Her body, pushed far beyond its limits, was shutting down. The narrator, watching from an invisible perch, could feel the life force draining from her, a candle flame flickering violently in a harsh wind. This was not a performance. This was a surrender, a quiet, physical capitulation to months of hunger, fear, and cold. She was a soldier falling on a battlefield, her war finally irrevocably lost. The fortress of her will was crumbling from the inside out. She collapsed. It was not a dramatic, theatrical fall, but a slow, boneless folding, as if her strings had been cut. Her body crumpled onto the cold marble, the impact a soft, dull thud that was somehow louder than any shout in the cavernous silence that followed. The guard, still clutching her arm, stumbled, caught completely off guard by the dead weight. The crowd gasped, their phones still raised, but the scorn on their faces was replaced by a flicker of shock, even fear. The spectacle had suddenly become too real, too raw. The abstract concept of a problem had just transformed into a broken human being lying at their feet. Adrian stood frozen, a statue of tailored wool and ice, watching the chaos he had tried to contain now explode in the most visceral, undeniable way imaginable. On the edge of consciousness, with the world fading to a pinpoint of light, Eleanor's lips moved. Her hand, which had been clutching the children's book, went to her belly, a final, instinctual act of protection. A whisper, so faint it was more a breath than a sound, escaped her. It was a word not meant for the hostile crowd or the cold millionaire, but for the tiny, fluttering life inside her, the only person who had never judged her. The only reason she had endured. It was an apology, a prayer and a promise, all contained in a single sacred utterance. In the encroaching darkness of her mind, she was no longer in a ballroom full of enemies. She was alone with her child, speaking his name into the void as a final act of love. Matthew. The name was a ghost, a wisp of sound that should have been lost in the vast, silent room. But for Adrian Blackwood, it was a thunderclap. It struck the reinforced walls of his heart, and they did not crack. They shattered into a million pieces. The narrator saw the past 5 years of meticulously constructed apathy evaporate in an instant. Matthew. It was the name his wife had whispered against his cheek as they looked at the empty nursery. It was the name on a tiny, uncarved headstone in a cemetery he could no longer bring himself to visit. It was the name of the son he never got to hold, the future that had been stolen from him. The universe, in its infinite cruelty and grace, had just spoken it aloud through the lips of a dying stranger on his floor. The cold, calculating CEO was gone, annihilated by a single word. In his place stood a man drowning in a grief he had thought long buried. The mask of indifference melted away, revealing the raw, unhealed wound beneath. He no longer saw a vagrant who had stained his rug. He saw the ghost of his wife, her body failing, her spirit fighting for a life she would never know. He saw an echo of his own unbearable tragedy playing out before his very eyes. The blood on the floor was no longer an insult. It was a sacrament, a terrifying and sacred symbol of the fragility of life, of the battle every mother wages. The woman on the floor was not a stranger. She was a reflection of everything he had ever loved and lost. A sound tore from Adrian's throat, a raw, ragged command that cracked with 5 years of unshed tears. Stop! The order was not directed at the guards, but at fate, at time, at the memory that was consuming him. The security men froze, their hands hovering uselessly. The guests stared, their phones forgotten, as they witnessed the complete unraveling of the city's most impenetrable man. He stumbled forward, his movements no longer precise and controlled, but clumsy and desperate. He pushed past the stunned guard and dropped to his knees beside Elena, the fine fabric of his $1,000 suit creasing on the cold, unforgiving marble. He was no longer the master of the mansion. He was just a man, on the floor, with his ghosts. Gently, his hand trembling, he reached out and brushed a strand of matted hair from her pale cheek. The touch was hesitant, almost reverent, as if he were touching a sacred relic. He looked from her still face to the swell of her belly, and the last of his defenses crumbled into dust. He saw not her unborn child, but the ghost of his, the promise that had died with his wife. He saw the same hope, the same love, the same terrifying vulnerability. For the first time, he truly understood. He understood the desperation that drove her into his home, the primal need to protect the life she carried. Do you believe a single moment can shatter a lifetime of prejudice? Share your thoughts if this story is moving you. He looked at the security guards, his eyes blazing with a fire they had never seen. Call my personal doctor. Now, he commanded, his voice thick with an authority reborn not from power, but from profound, earth-shattering empathy. Tell him it's an emergency. For my family. The word hung in the air, a shocking, impossible declaration that reconfigured the reality of the entire room. He then turned back to Eleanor, his focus absolute. The world, with its judgments and its cameras, ceased to exist. There was only this woman, this child, and the name that connected their broken worlds. He was not just saving a stranger, he was trying, desperately, to save a piece of his own lost soul. Then, Adrian Blackwood did something that would be whispered about in the city's elite circles for years to come. He leaned down, his face close to her pregnant belly, and he pressed his lips to the thin, worn fabric of her coat. It was not a kiss of romance or pity. It was a kiss of apology, of reverence, of a shared and sacred grief. It was a silent promise to the ghost of his son and a solemn vow to the unborn child who now carried his name. In that single, breathtaking gesture of humility, he washed away the stain on the rug with the tears he hadn't realized were streaming down his face. A bridge had been built between two shattered souls, forged in the fires of loss, and named for the hope of a child named Matthew. Ignoring the collective gasp of his guests, Adrian gently scooped Elena into his arms. Her body was frighteningly light, a fragile weight against the strength he hadn't used for anything but closing deals and shutting doors. He turned his back on the sea of shocked faces and their glowing phones, his world shrinking to the unconscious woman he held. "Clear a path," he commanded, his voice a low growl that held no room for argument. "And someone get Mrs. Gable. Prepare the East Wing suite. Now." He moved through the crowd, not as a host, but as a force of nature, a man on a singular, sacred mission. He was no longer protecting his property or his reputation. He was shielding a life, a hope, a memory named Matthew, and in doing so, he was finally protecting himself. Elena awoke to the scent of lavender and clean cotton. The world returned not as a cold, hard reality, but as a soft, warm dream. She was lying in a bed so vast and comfortable it felt like a cloud, wearing silk pajamas that were softer than anything she had ever touched. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile was checking her vitals. "You're safe," the doctor said softly. "You and your baby are going to be fine. You just needed rest, nourishment, and care." Eleanor blinked, the words barely registering. Care. It was a foreign concept, a language she had forgotten. She looked around the opulent room, at the sunlight streaming through a tall window, and a single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of profound, terrifying relief. Later, Adrian stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel. He held a tray with a bowl of warm soup and a glass of water. He was no longer the icy executioner from the ballroom, but a man hollowed out by grief, his movements careful and deliberate. He placed the tray on a table beside her bed. "The doctor said you need to eat slowly," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its former arrogance. Elena watched him, her fear warring with her pride. She didn't want his pity. "Why?" she whispered, the single word holding all her confusion and suspicion. Adrian looked away, toward the window. "Matthew," he said, the name a fragile piece of glass. "It was my son's name." He offered no more, but in that shared word, a bridge of understanding was built over an ocean of pain. He didn't offer her money. He knew, instinctively, that it would be an insult to the fierce dignity he had witnessed. Instead, he offered her a purpose. "My wife. She always wanted to start a foundation," he began, his voice strained with memory. "A place for women like her, for mothers who had nowhere else to go." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes holding a new, clear light. "I'm going to build it, in her name, and I want you to help me. Not as a recipient, but as a counselor, as a founder. Your story, your strength, that will be its heart." It wasn't charity. It was an anointing. He was handing her the tools to rebuild not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. He was giving her back her power. Elena stared at the man before her, seeing not a millionaire but another survivor. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, the gesture sealing a pact that transcended words. He had offered her a home, but more than that, he had offered her a voice. Later, after she had eaten, he returned and placed a small antique silver key on the bedside table. "This is your room now," he said simply. "You are safe here, you and Matthew." He left without another word, closing the door softly behind him. Elena picked up the key, its cool weight a solid, undeniable promise in her palm. Justice, she realized, wasn't always a thunderous victory. Sometimes it was the quiet click of a lock, a door opening into a future she finally believed she deserved. 6 months passed, not as a measure of time, but as the slow, steady return of color to a faded photograph. The East Wing suite was no longer a luxurious prison, but a sanctuary, a chrysalis where Elena rediscovered herself. The fear that had lived in her bones for so long had receded, replaced by the quiet strength of a body that was finally nourished and a spirit that was finally safe. She would often stand by the window, her hand on her growing belly, and watch Adrian in the garden below. He moved differently now. The rigid, cold precision was gone, replaced by a softer, more contemplative pace. He was a man learning to breathe again after years of holding his breath, and she, in turn, was learning that kindness was not always a trap. They were two ghosts, haunting the same house, slowly learning to be alive together. The Blackwood Matthews Foundation was born not in a sterile boardroom, but in a sunlit brownstone filled with the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. It was Adrian's penance and his wife's legacy, but it was Eleanor's soul. She walked through the unfinished rooms, her voice, once a hoarse whisper, now clear and steady as she described what was needed. Not just beds and meals, but dignity, a library with real books, a playroom filled with color, a quiet room where women could simply sit and remember who they were before the world tried to erase them. Adrian listened, not as a benefactor, but as a student. He was funding the structure, but she was providing its heart. He was building walls to keep women safe. She was building doors for them to walk through into a new life. When the time came, Matthew was born not into the cold indifference of the city, but into a room filled with warmth and quiet reverence. Adrian stood in the corner, a silent, unmoving guardian, his face a canvas of emotions he had long since buried. As the baby's first cry echoed in the sterile room, it was not the sound of a stranger's child, but the sound of a promise fulfilled, a circle finally closed. When the nurse placed the swaddled infant in Elena's arms, Adrian saw not the tragedy of his past, but the fierce, beautiful, undeniable reality of the present. He saw a mother and her son, whole and safe. Later, when Elena offered for him to hold the baby, his hands trembled. He was not replacing his loss, but honoring it, finding a way to let love back into the empty spaces of his heart. Their evenings settled into a new, unspoken rhythm, forming a family bound not by blood, but by shared healing. Often, Adrian would sit in an armchair, the light from a single lamp pooling around him, and read aloud from the worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. His voice, once a weapon in the boardroom, was now a soft, gentle cadence that lulled baby Matthew to sleep. Elena would watch them from the doorway, her heart aching with a gratitude so profound it felt like grief. They were a strange, broken trio, a woman who had lost everything, a man who had walled himself away from the world, and a child who represented a second chance for them both. They were proof that sometimes the most beautiful things are built from the sharpest, most painful fragments of a shattered life. One crisp autumn afternoon, they stood on the foundation's rooftop terrace, looking out over the sprawling city. The skyline that had once seemed like a row of jagged teeth now looked like a promise. Eleanor held a sleeping Matthew close, his warmth a steady anchor against the wind. "I used to think this city was a monster," she said softly, her voice carrying no trace of her past bitterness. Adrian stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's just a place," he replied quietly. "It's what we choose to build in it that matters." They had built something from the rubble of their lives, a sanctuary, a legacy, a hope. Do you believe that our deepest pain can become our greatest purpose? We want to hear your story. On the day the foundation officially opened, Adrian met Elena at the entrance. He didn't offer a speech or a grand gesture. Instead, he placed a single, ornate brass key into her hand. It was the master key to the building. "This was never mine to give," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "It was always yours to build." Elena closed her hand around it, the metal cool and solid against her skin. It was heavier than a key. It was the weight of a restored life, of a future she now owned. She looked from the key in her hand to the open door before her, and a small, certain smile touched her lips. She was no longer a stain to be removed, but a founder, a mother, a beginning. Dignity, she finally understood, wasn't something you were given. It was the home you built inside yourself, one brick of hope at a time. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to believe in new beginnings.